know that you kneel
Oh, it's good to see so many people back again. I put the donations envelope out down here. If anybody would like to slip anything in there, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good. I'm glad. Thank you. Okay, good enough. Okay, so we're going to finish Greek art today and start on the Roman Empire. Is this too loud? Okay, because I like it up like this, because then I can turn my head and don't have to worry about it. I can see. Okay. Welcome, Zoomies. Good to see you. Nothing personal, but I'm going to move you down here to the corner. So if you have a question or anything, please just yell out so I can hear you. Mute for now and then unmute and yell out if you have a question. Everybody else here, yell out anytime you want. Okay, so where we were last time is we had just started to talk about classical art, and I had made this comparison between the earlier archaic figure on the left and that early classical figure on the right. And while many of the changes are obvious, it's much more naturalistic, much more believable as a human figure. But the biggest difference, what we really look at, is the stance. And in the classical period, you find this new position of the body called contrapposto, which literally means turning against, like contraposition. And what it is a weight shift, meaning that his weight is principally on one leg while the other is relaxed, as opposed to the older figure where his weight is evenly divided on two legs. And the one on the right is much more natural. It's how we actually stand. If you're standing, pay attention to how you stand. If you're standing for a few minutes talking to somebody, think about it. You're standing on one leg. You almost never stand, at least not for more than a few seconds with your weight even. You'll stand on one, and then you tend to shift your weight back and forth between. That's okay. Everybody's checking their phones down.
Hey, Peggy, is your screen shared?
I thought I did. It says you are screen sharing. You're not seeing the images? You're not seeing two sculptures?
Well, there they are. Okay, let me, it might be my issue. It's my issue. Never mind, sorry. Just wanted to double check.
Always check. I'm gonna assume everybody out there can see. If you cannot see two sculptures right now, please yell at me.
All right. I think it's good. I think it's good. It was on my end. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. No problem. It's not that I haven't ever forgotten to screen share, which I did day one. Okay, so when you shift your weight in contrapposto, what it does is it throws your hips off. One hip will be higher than the other. It also affects your shoulders and the twist of your spine, although in this early figure, we don't see that yet. What I want to look at now is one of the finest examples from the early classical period. And that is this wonderful figure known as Warrior A from Riace. In 1972, divers who were about 25 foot down off the coast of Riace in Italy, off the coast of Italy, saw sticking up straight up from under the sand an arm. And first they thought they found like a body, like a dead body. And as they looked at it, it was the arm of one of two sculptures. They brought in the archaeologists right away and excavated and found two figures. They just named them Warrior A and Warrior B. This is Warrior A. The one on the far right shown with the divers, that's actually the other one, that's Warrior B. When they brought them up, they were very corroded, covered in lime, incrustations, etc. But they managed to clean them up beautifully. He is bronze. He dates between 460 and 450 BCE. And it, to me, is, I think, one of the finest examples of Greek art. It's right at that period. It's classical. It's technically late, early classical. We have all sorts of distinctions. It's early classical, and I'll explain why, but it's right at the end of early classical. If someone wanted to come in and argue with me that this is high classical, I could give you an argument, but Greek's art is changing so dramatically and quickly. We look at small things to sort of make these divisions. So bronze figure, and we'll talk about the medium in just a moment. He is identified as a warrior because on that bent arm, he has a shield attached to the back of his hand, and probably had a javelin of some type in that hand as well. It was probably wooden and disappeared a long time ago, being underwater for so long. When we look at his stance, we recognize the position, contrapposto position, but you can see even more clearly now the shifting of the body. The hips are shifted, but so are the shoulders, and so is the spine. The shoulders shift in opposition to the hips, and from the back you can see the curving of the spine. It's a subtle recognition of the human form, particularly the male form, which is the ideal in Greek art. That is the sort of perfect form.
What era is this?
This is classical. It's early classical, so 460, 450 BCE.
Perfect.
I think he is, yeah. There is an intensity to this figure. He's strong, his body is tense. He's also inlaid beautifully. You can see his eyes are still in place. They're made of bone and colored glass and some other materials. They used an amber paste to sort of hold them in place, which makes him a very realistic. There's a lot of energy to his face, especially his eyebrows. Things like his eyebrows right up here. This is what identifies him as still early classical. There's still a certain amount of tension in them, and they're a bit stylized. They're a bit simplified. They're not totally naturalistic. The older pieces just had a sharp cut. He still has a bit of that, so it's not as fully finished. You can see the inlay there. Basically, he also has copper. His lips and nipples are inlaid with copper. His teeth are silver plated, and he has individually attached eyelashes that were cast in bronze. That's not uncommon. We don't have many bronze figures. Well, I want to talk about the material in just a moment. This use of bronze is new to the classical period. Archaic figures are all just marble carving, but we begin to see bronze cast figures in the classical period. We have very, very few of them. That's why the Riace find was so important. When I was in school, we had 7. So I'm not aware of too many more found since then. I'm talking about full size, not little figurines. We have lots of little bronzes, but full size, fully developed classical bronzes. There are very, very few. Now, there were a lot more. Most of what we look at when we look at classical art is going to be Roman copies, and I want to talk about that in just a few minutes when we look at some Roman copies. But this is a rare bronze original. Now, I want to talk about how they were cast. Generally, they were cast in multiple pieces, generally, oh, I don't know, 7 to 8 pieces. This, however, was cast in one piece. Very rare that a figure like this would be cast in one solid piece. That's very, very hard to do. The way they cast in bronze was not that different from the way people cast in bronze today. They used what was called the lost wax method. And you would start with, let's say you're going to cast the head separately. You would make a clay figure of whatever you were casting. And then you would cover that clay figure with wax. And it was a beeswax, not a soft wax, but it's a fairly hard wax. And then into that wax, you carve all the details, all the little hairs, all the subtle details. It's wax, so you can carve detail a lot easier than you could chisel detail into marble. You can get fine detail. So now you've put the detail into that wax. Now what you do is add an outer layer of clay on top of it. This is generally a clay that has a little more sand mixed in with it, and you press that outer clay over the top. So basically, it's like a wax sandwich. You've got clay, wax in the middle, and then more clay. So basically, there's a sort of a chamber in there where the wax is. Now what you do, you stick some rods in there to support it. Those little black things are just rods that are stuck through. And now you put it into a kiln. And now the clay is going to bake and become hard, a ceramic. And at the same time, you're melting the wax, which is going to pour out the bottom in a hole. Now, when you're done with that, you can take it out of the kiln. And now you've just got a hollow space where the wax was. So now you plug up that bottom hole, and now you can pour in molten bronze, and the bronze will fill in the space where the wax was. And in fact, the bronze will pick up every little detail that you had carved into the wax. So that's why it's called lost wax. It's the lost wax method. And then now you let the bronze cool, then all you have to do is take a hammer, hit that outer ceramic, it'll just shatter, and there's your beautiful bronze with all of the detail of the piece. That's how you do it. Now and then, because it's a single part, like the head, you can sort of pull out the inner clay or break it up and pull it out. This figure, however, because it was cast as one solid piece, it still had the inner clay inside of it, but they found a way to remove it. I don't know how they did it, but somehow they got it removed. But at the time, there was no way to remove the inner clay, so they just left it. So why bronze? Why did they prefer bronze over marble? Well, if I ask my students, which I typically did, which is heavier, metal or stone, they're going to tell me metal every time, because they're thinking of big, heavy iron bars and things like that. In their minds, metal is heavier, but this is hollow bronze. It's much, much lighter than a stone or marble sculpture would be. So being lightweight, that was a huge benefit. Because of that, it could support its own weight very easily. It could stand, as you see, just on those 2 feet. It didn't need extra support to hold it up, which, as we will see, marble sculptures often do, especially if you have arms out like this on a marble sculpture, you probably need some added support for it. Of course, the greater detail is an important reason for choosing the bronze. The fact that because of the wax, you can carve in all these little details of every little hair there in his beard, etc., all the muscles and tones. And you can make it much more lifelike, and that's why they preferred bronze. So if the vast majority of Greek classical sculptures were bronze, and there would have been hundreds and hundreds of them, where are they? Why don't we find them? And why do we find a few? Well, I'll tell you now, the few we have were found because they were either buried underground or sunken on a ship. In other words, they were out of sight. They weren't out exposed. So what happened to all the bronzes?
They got melted down.
They got melted down. Why? Lots of reasons. One, bronze is a precious metal, and throughout the Middle Ages, bronze was worth a lot more to people to melt down and make weapons and other things, tools, and make things out of. Also, in the Christian era, these were considered pagan figures. So it was twofold. Christians would destroy them if they thought it was some pagan god, they're going to melt it down, but they also wanted the bronze. It was a little bit of benefit for both. So they were, any bronze they would have found, they melted. Yes.
Okay, I'm having trouble getting my mind around what kind of a kiln would you have to have?
A big one.
A huge kiln,
Yeah.
and these were fired by wood, I'm assuming.
Yeah, wood fired.
So you really
Probably.
couldn't regulate temperature.
You could regulate it some, you could regulate it. You could regulate
But
temperature.
I just can't imagine a kiln that size.
Well, these would have been made in professional shops. This wouldn't have been a backyard
No.
deal. This would have been a professional sculptor shop who probably had huge kilns and made hundreds and hundreds of these. So it would have been like a factory situation, not, yes, but a big one.
A big one, yes.
Yeah, clearly professionally done, and professionally well done. So we're thrilled that this sank on a ship, one of those hundreds of ships at the bottom of the Mediterranean. And that gives us hope that there's more out there.
And where were they taking them?
well,
Ships? Did they
Interestingly,
sell them somewhere or?
yeah, they're some of the big sculpture, I don't want to call them factories, but workshops, a lot of them, they weren't in every city. There would have been places, there were 2 or 3 places I know on the, in the colonies, like on Rhodes. For several hundred years, the island of Rhodes housed a major artistic center. There are some other Greek islands that were like that. So they could have been bringing them sort of anywhere in Greece. This was found off the coast of Italy, and there were Greek colonies all along there. So undoubtedly, they weren't, this probably wouldn't have been made in Italy, it would have been being brought to Italy. And so probably it was probably traveling along the coast of Italy when it sank.
Maybe.
Yeah.
The teeth on this bronze fascinating. Is it unusual to have teeth shown on a sculpture like this?
Well, it is. That's what dates us to this moment in time. You don't see it later, you don't see it earlier. Good point. That's what gives him a fierce quality, the fact that his mouth is open. You certainly didn't see it in the archaic pieces, and you're not going to see it in the high classical. You'll start seeing this stuff again late in the Hellenistic. So yeah, that's not typical, but it is this one moment in time. And when, even 10 years later, you're not going to see this. In fact, I'll show you something from 10 to 20 years later when we move into the high classical. This creates too much emotion. And it's right on a tipping point.
Do you know where this sculpture is today? Museum, wherever?
This particular one, it's probably in Italy somewhere. I'm not really sure. I'd have to check. I know where the classical ones are. Now, as we move into the high classical 450 or so, like the second half of the 5th century, I want to talk about one mathematician and sculptor named Polykaleidos. He was both a mathematician and a sculptor, and that is important because those two things absolutely go together, especially in the high classical period. He wrote a small book titled The Canon. And a canon is a set of rules, right? We still use the term that way. It's a canon, a set of rules that you follow. And in the canon, he outline and define what he saw as the perfect set of proportions for the male figure. And he defined that as symmetria. This is what you're always searching for. And he defined his proportions as symmetria. That torso you're looking at is actually a Roman copy of what was once a bronze original sculpture. And I'm going to show you another version of that same sculpture in just a moment. One that he made as a demonstration piece that accompanied his book called The Canon. And in the word symmetria, you can see our word symmetry, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Symmetria to the Greeks meant the perfect ratio of all of the parts. It meant the perfect ratio of all of the parts to one another and the individual parts to the whole. And as you can see from the little diagram, everything is measured and proportioned. In other words, if you know one measurement of a human figure, like if I told you the distance between this knuckle and that knuckle was 1 inch, from that number, you could calculate the entire body, because you know that ratio to this ratio, and that ratio to that ratio, and that ratio to that ratio. If anybody would have benefited from a computer, it was the Greeks. This would have helped them a lot, but they were doing it even without that. That precise detail. They're looking for the formula for beauty. They're looking for this algorithm that defines perfection, that defines the ideal. Now, we talked about idealism last time and Plato's sense that the ideal can only exist in your mind. Well, Polyclitus is looking for a way to bring that ideal out into the physical world. There must be a formula for it. There must be a set of numbers. And he's looking at the world as a mathematician and recognizing the ratios and the geometry of the world that he lives in, and using that and trying to find a way to create perfection. It's, yes.
Did he do one for women?
Oh, no. Perfection is found in the male body, not the female.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, you missed that. You missed that point. Well, now we know. No, he did not. Perfection is clearly a male phenomenon, as is everything else. We talked about how women fared better in ancient Egypt than anywhere else in the ancient world. Well, they fared worse in ancient Greece than anywhere else in the ancient world. Women were really almost considered another species. In fact, a lot of the language really does talk about women as almost another species, incapable of having intellectual relationship, a real relationship, friendship with a man. You know, that you have those relationships with other men, not with women. And even though right in front of them, there were actually a number of very smart and important women in ancient Greece, a few of them later, not during this early period, but no, it is strictly male. Now this, yes.
Part of my speech. But I was thinking of Michelangelo, hundreds of years later. His left hand, the left hand of David, is he didn't have symmetry to go on.
I was thinking of Michelangelo when I was talking about him just now as well. Michelangelo is very influenced by Greek art, but not this Greek art. He's influenced by late Hellenistic art, and I'm going to talk about that possibly even today, but definitely next time. I'll show you one of the pieces that influenced him. He's not into the classical. Michelangelo's art is emotional and powerful, and that's not this period, that's later, that's Hellenistic. But Michelangelo also looked to the male body. Michelangelo could not, I'm sorry, I love Michelangelo, but he couldn't do women. If you've ever seen a woman sculpted by Michelangelo, it's a man with breasts. It's not a woman. I guarantee you. When we get there, I'll show you. But they're absolutely male bodies, 100%, with 2 breasts stuck in the middle. I don't know if he ever looked at a female body, but he couldn't sculpt them. And that was fine. He didn't care. And it was about the male body. He was very influenced by, well, as was all the Renaissance.
Adding old bricks, they must have taken off a few things too.
Yeah, or covered it up. I don't. Anyway, this is another copy of the same sculpture. Both that torso and this whole figure are copies, Roman copies of a lost bronze figure that was sculpted by Polyclitus as a demonstration piece. So this has the exact mathematical proportions that he talks about. It's considered sort of the epitome of the classical. In fact, there are a number of different versions of this sculpture, but this particular one is certainly the best known, one of the most famous. The spear bearer, some people say it's meant to be Apollo. Sometimes he's just called the Doryphorus, which means spear bearer. He would have, again, in that one hand, there would have been a long lance, a wooden lance, but it pulls together all of his ideal. Now, the Romans, why we look at these, we call them Greek. I would never call this Roman, don't ever call this Roman. This is Greek, 100% Greek, even though technically I don't like calling these copies. Everywhere you will ever read will call this a Roman copy. I prefer to think of them as replicas, because in my mind, for some reason, there's a difference between a replica and a copy. Maybe that's just me, but a replica is an identical version. And the Romans were really good at it. They had these like, have you seen those things that kids play with that have like all these pins that stick out and you can press in it and it takes the shape? Well, they have devices like that they would use to copy sculpture. They could like press it in and it would pick up every detail of a sculpture, and then they would carve it from that. So if it's a quality Roman copy, you can believe that that's what the bronze looked like. You have to imagine this at bronze. Although some of you know why, because you've had this class before, why we can look at this and know that it's not an original. There are other elements to the sculpture that tell us it is a copy or replica. Does anybody remember what that is? Yeah.
The pedestal that helps with the.
Yes.
This thing,
balance.
yeah, that is there for support. It's needed in a marble sculpture. It is not needed in a bronze original. That's an addition. He's trying to disguise it, I think, as a sort of tree trunk possibly, but it's out of place. And then one other little thing. That, yes, the little stud right here at the wrist, that is also needed to give it additional support and keep it from just breaking off. Yes.
It's like he has a muffin top.
Well, those are supposed to be muscles as opposed to fat. Those are that. I have muscles there too. Do you have muscles there? Those are our muscles. The bigger they are, the stronger we are. But yeah, they're meant to be just muscles. They're just accentuating muscles. Notice his face. Have you ever seen a more empty face in your life? I mean, that's clearly not a portrait. This is an idealized, it's as generic as is humanly possible to be. And there is nothing there. That is the Greek ideal. Not that his mind is empty, but that he's totally in control. Greeks were obsessed with control, that idea of showing emotion. To them, emotion is the lack of control. It's being out of control. So controlling yourself, he is absolutely in control. So it is the ideal and quite different from the face of the Riace warrior from just a decade or so earlier. Very, very different. But there's a lot of subtleties here I want to talk about. Yeah, he is in the contrapposto stance. Well, here, let's compare the Riace warrior. They are different ratios, they're different proportions. The body is in a different canon in terms of the proportions of the body, but they're standing in a fairly similar manner. What they have, particularly actually, I'd say the Doryphorus is just the opposite. They both have their left arm bent, but the Riace warrior standing on his right leg, while the Doryphorus has his weight. Oh, they both standing on their right leg, but he has his bent leg back, which almost gives a sense of moving, stepping a little bit. What they have is a kind of cross-body balance. In other words, the right arm and the left leg are relaxed, while the right leg and the left arm are tense. So it's across the body. little subtle things like that. The turning of the head, both of them have that little turning of the head, which gives a little bit of motion. It takes you beyond the archaic piece. So this is the essence of the high classical idealized word demonstrating both contrapposto and symmetria. It's seen as understood to be the kind of height of artistic culture, intellectual contributions of the Greeks. This is how they saw it. Doesn't mean we necessarily have, this changes over time, personal preferences. I find the high classical, which is so-called golden age, to be the least interesting of all of Greek art. That's just our taste, and people have seen it differently over time, depending on the moment you live in.
Would he have had a spear? He's a spear carrier.
Yes, he would have had a wooden spear in that hand.
Wouldn't.
Wooden. They always just had probably a real javelin, and it just doesn't last. It rotted away a long time ago, but yeah, they both would have had real wooden javelins. As we come down to this mid-century period, the high classical period, it's the age of Pericles. And Pericles is one of the most famous of all of the Greeks. He's associated with democracy. If we were really doing a real history class, we could spend so much more time talking about all of this, but there simply isn't time. He was vying with power, for power in Athens with Thucydides. Thucydides was ostracized in 442. And I want to talk about ostracism because I think it's the greatest thing the Greeks ever invented. And sometimes I wish we had it. Ostracism is when once a year, all of the Greeks could submit a name of someone, anyone that they wanted ostracized from the city for 10 years. You could throw anybody out of the city for 10 years. And it typically was someone who they believed threatened their democracy. A politician, it could be a senator, it could be anybody they thought was a threat and they just wanted them out. You could just vote them out. What a great idea. Anyway.
Vote about, or you could just.
You had to vote, whoever won.
Could you throw out your ex-husband? I mean, this.
If the majority wants him gone, he's gone.
Okay, just.
If the majority wants him gone. So those are ostraka that you see there. They're clay ballots and they have names inscribed on them. People could submit names of anybody they wanted, and then like the highest, I don't know how many, would be on the final ballot, and then you'd have to vote for one of those 10 or however many. And so those are the ostraka with the names on them. That's where the word, ostracized comes from. And Thucydides was ostracized, leaving Pericles really alone, sort of in the position of power. And so he was voted the title general, which is the only title he ever really had, was general, which was a position of honor. And this is where he now begins to build the golden age of Athens. We talked last time about the Persian War and how the Greeks stopped the Persian advance, pushed them back, and how Athens really took pride in doing that and saw themselves as the ones that were the most responsible for it. Remember, they'd been building this treasury on the island of Delos just in case the Persians came back. Well, after 10 years or so, it was obvious the Persians weren't coming back, and this treasury was there, and all the Greek city-states were paying into it. And the Athens said, well, listen, they damaged our city. We have a right to that money. We're going to take that money. And that's when Pericles decides it belongs to Athens. Now, the Greek city-states were already bothering each other. By 470, after the Persians were kicked out, it isn't long before all the Greek city-states are these little skirmishes and disputes among them. They're building towards civil war, which will happen by 431. Actual warfare will break out. But even before then, they're angry with each other. There are disturbances, and Athens in particular is pissing everybody off because they've looted the treasury. They trying to push people around. They never went out and tried to build an empire. We talk about the Athenian Empire, but that's largely a sphere of influence as opposed to territory conquered. It's not like the Roman Empire where they're out there really conquering territory and ruling the world. Athens wasn't like that, but they still wanted to control everybody. And we're going to loot the Delian treasury. And one thing we're going to do about it is we're going to build the Acropolis. It was there before, but it was completely damaged and destroyed. And we're going to build this beautiful new place. And I love that quote from Pericles: future generations will marvel at us as the present age marvels at us now. I mean, they're suffering from extreme hubris, something we know from the mythology class plagued the Greeks. They were always afraid of hubris and were always warning about it. And so many Greek myths centered on the idea of hubris, which is sort of excessive self-aggrandizement. But this is what they're going to build. Overseen by Pericles as the politician in charge and funded by the Delian League, but also Phidias. Phidias had a huge sculpture shop, and he oversaw all of the sculpture. And there's a huge sculpture program on all the buildings, individual sculptures, and then individual architects for the buildings. And I principally want to look at the largest building here, which is the Temple to Athena. And we'll talk about that in a minute, dedicated to Athena Parthenos. All Greek temples faced east. I think I mentioned that briefly, so that when you open the doors, the rising sun would shine in on the cult figure. So the actual entrance to the Parthenon is on the far side, way around here. This is actually the back. You have to enter from that side. So let's take a look at this building, which was designed by two architects, Ectinos and Kallikratis. And the sculpture is all by Phidias. I like having some people in the picture so you can get a sense of the scale of the building itself. In fact, Ectinos wrote a book on this building as well. There was a precedent for it. And so he wrote a book and talked about the proportions and ratios and how they decided everything. It's based on the proportions of 4:9, which you see in the basic proportions of the rectangle. There are 8 columns on the 2 short sides and 17 columns on the long side. That's a proportion of 4:9, meaning it's 2x plus 1. It's a mathematical formula. So 8 columns, the long end would be 2 times the short end plus 1. So 8 columns, 2 times that would be 16. Add 1 makes 17. That's why there are 17 columns on the long side and 8 columns on the short side. So it's mathematically calculated to be the most beautiful, perfect being, which is still rooted in the proportions of the human form. So even architecture is influenced by these proportions. So we're going to take a look at several parts of it. It's marble. It's 100% Pentelic marble. Pentelic marble comes from Pentelicon, which is a quarry not too far from Athens. It's a white marble. Pentelic is not really used for sculpture very often. That's usually Parian marble. They're both pure white marbles, but Pentelic has a slight yellow tint so that sunrise, sunset, it sort of glows. It's a little bit different. It's better for architecture than it is for sculpture. It's built in a similar manner to what we've seen before when we compare it to that early archaic temple we saw, which now looks very short and squat, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can really see the difference, how the columns are so much wider, the heavy entablature pushes down on them. Now the Parthenon, as it's known, or the Temple of Athena Parthenos, which is its correct name, the columns are much taller and thinner. They're going to become even more so. Parthenos refers to the fact that she is a virgin. One of the most essential characteristics of Athena is she's a virgin warrior and guards her chastity. So Athena Parthenos is a reference to that aspect of her as the sort of virgin warrior. And I'd like to take a look at some details of it. The pediments, their sculpture in the pediments, we're going to talk about those in a moment. So there would have been two pediments, one on each end with sculpture. The majority of the sculpture from this building is, of course, where? In the British Museum, of course. Yes, the Elgin marbles. I want to say something about the Elgin marbles. Lord Elgin was the representative of the British Empire to the Ottoman court. Because at the time that the marbles were removed, Greece was part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and in fact was not being taken care of. The Turkish soldiers would often use the sculpture for target practice. This was not their culture or their history. And Lord Elgin, when he asked, could he please remove these sculptures, he really was trying to save them. As much as we constantly are talking about how the British are looting the sculpture of the world, I do want to say he had very good reason for what he did at the time. However, the Turks are long gone and the Greeks want their sculpture back. Now, I can forgive them for taking them, but now it's time to give them back. But that's never going to happen. And we know why the British are never going to give any of their art back. Because England would have no more art. Because almost everything they have is from all around the world. I mean, it's just, they can't afford it. They just can't afford to do it. Even though they keep promising they will, whatever. So that's where the pediments are, and so are the triglyphs and metopes, or the metopes anyway. The triglyphs and metopes, we're going to look at some of those as well. Now, I want to talk about the subtle refinements on this building, most of which are not visible to the human eye. That little diagram is an exaggerated view of the subtle changes. You can't see those things, but that's where they are. First of all, the base itself, the stylobate, is curved. It's taller in the middle on every side. Now, there are practical reasons for that. Water can run off, etc. But it also gives the building a slight, subtle, perhaps subconscious sense of movement. And the entablatures are also curved in the same way, and they don't need to be. There's no water being held up there, but they're curved in the same ratio. Every column is leaning slightly inward. And that means every column is slightly different from the columns around it, which means every drum of every column has to be individually carved for that specific location. It, of course, also has, and Tassus, I'll talk about that in a second. Before we move on, I have to tell you about this. One of my favorite Greek things, because it's something that nobody would ever know or ever see, but it matters to the Greeks. And that is what was known as the triglyph problem. Now, as you move across the facade or the side of the building, the rhythm of triglyph and metope is there's a triglyph directly over the center of every column and another triglyph directly over the center of the intercolumnar space. They're not just slapped up there anywhere. It's got to make sense, it's got to be precise. So that's how you have them, which works just fine until you come to a corner. Because as you get closer and closer to a corner, if you continue that, you end up with a triglyph here over the middle of the column, and then this strange little nothing thing on the end. There's not room for a sculpture, whatever. They wanted the corner to end in a triglyph so that it would sort of wrap around like this. But to do that, it means that two columns away, you have to very slightly start shifting microscopically the position of the triglyph. A little bit. Notice, whoops, didn't need to do that. Notice that this triglyph is not in the center. It's slightly over. It started 2 columns earlier, slightly shifting, so that by the time you get to the corner, you have a triglyph in the corner. Problem solved. That's the solution. Would anybody probably notice that? Highly unlikely, but it mattered. It's principle. That's Greek. And I'm telling you this because when we get to the Romans, we're going to see a very, very different sensibility. But that's how the Greeks thought about everything. On the plan, it's a peristyle temple, as we saw with Hera, meaning there are columns completely encircling it. That's a peristyle. And the outer order is a Doric order. We'll come back and look at those capitals again. As we normally see, it has a cella, a central room. In this case, columns in the cella that go all the way around. This is where the cult figure would be, and then the treasury in the back. Because there's an even number of columns on the short end, it means that right in the center, you have an open space, which is what you want, so that the sun can shine in the morning, straight down the middle on the great cult figure of Athena, which I'll show you in just a second. Let's look at the sculptural plan of this building. We talked a bit about this in the mythology class because we were talking about these stories. So some of you have seen this before. Over the two pediments, over the main entrance, we have the birth of Athena. And Athena was the daughter of Zeus and Metis. Metis was an Oceanid, and I'm not going to go into the mythology. If you had that class, you hopefully remember something about that. She was a nymph, a sea nymph. Her father was Zeus, but there was a prophecy that Metis would give birth to a son who would be stronger than his father. So to forego that prophecy, Zeus swallowed Metis while she was pregnant with Athena. And then when Metis's time to give birth came, Zeus found himself having these terrible headaches, and Hephaestus hit him in the head with an axe and split his head open, and Athena jumped out in full armor, fully grown and in full armor. That's the birth of Athena. Now, Metis remained still inside. Now, Metis, actually, the word Metis in Greek means wisdom. And Metis, the sea nymph, was a major advisor of Zeus's. And when she was inside of him, it's said that she just continued to advise him. She was like that little voice in his head, I guess, telling him things. And Athena is also a goddess of wisdom. So that's where that comes from. So, and that's why Athena was like a real favorite of Zeus's. He always really liked Athena. So that's the story in the pediment over the entrance. On the other side, the side that actually faces, the side that you see there in the picture, was the story, the contest between Athena and Poseidon for Athens. Athena had been sort of the patroness of the city of Athens. It's named for her, but Poseidon challenged her for control of the city. And so to prove his strength, he threw a trident down from Mount Olympus and made these three great holes on the Acropolis, and water bubbled up from the three holes that he made. But Athena, to show her power, had an olive tree grow up from the water. And so it was deemed that the olive tree was much more important to Athens, and so Athena wins and keeps the city. But that contest is an important one for the Athenians in terms of the myth, and so that's the story. Now, in the metopes, all the way around, there are four sides, and there are four stories. Each side tells a different story. The metopes over the entrance tell the story of the Gigantomachy. That is a war. Gigantomachy literally means war with the giants, and that is a war that the Olympic gods fought against the giants. Gaia, Mother Earth, sent these giants to fight the Olympians after they imprisoned her children, the Titans. First, the Olympic gods overthrew the older gods, their parents. They were the Titans, and they threw them into Tartarus, which is basically hell, the darkest hole in the underworld. Well, Gaia got mad and sent her other children, the giants, to fight the Olympians. So that's sort of the last war that the Olympians had to fight for their position. They defeated the giants. So on the north side, there are 32 metoepes that depict the sack of Troy. The story of the Trojan War is really a kind of core story for all of Greek mythology. It's a story that sort of ends all of Greek mythology. It's the end of all these stories are to end with the Trojan War. So it's very important. So 32 scenes from that. Over the west side, we get the Amazonomachy, which is a story of the Amazon female warriors fighting. This is just an Athenian story, not all of Greece, but it's when Theseus, the Athenian hero, abducted Hippolytus, the queen of the Amazons, and they had a war between the Athenians and the Amazons. And of course, the Athenians won. And then along the south side, we have 32 scenes from the Centauromachy, which is a war with the centaurs. And the centaurs are half horse, half man. And this has to do with a story of a wedding that the centaurs weren't invited to, but they came anyway. And then they drank and got drunk and started running off with all the women, and a war ensues from that. And it's a battle between the Lapiths and the centaurs. The Lapiths were a Greek tribe. So one thing that all of these stories have in common, what is the one thing? They're all wars won by the Greeks or somebody that symbolizes the Greeks, either a Greek tribe or the Greek gods. The enemy symbolized for the Greeks the barbarian, right? They're all about the civilized Greeks defeating a barbarian force. That's what they're all about. Now, this is built with the money taken from the Delian League, which was money accumulated for the defense of Greece from the Persians, whom the Athenians just thought of themselves in their minds anyway. They just defeated the Persian Empire. While there are no images of Greeks defeating Persians on this building, everything on this building is really about Greeks defeating Persians. It's all these are just metaphors, one more version of the same story. The Greeks saw themselves as civilized people defeating the barbarians, i.e. Greeks defeating Persians. So it may not depict the Persian War, but it's nonetheless very much the Greeks speaking about that victory and who they are and how civilized they are. Yes.
There is a copy of the Parthenon in Nashville. It's not this big though, is it?
It's the exact size.
Is it?
It's a perfect replica. Everything is exactly the size.
Oh, in the picture, it looked much.
No, it's
bigger.
not. It's not. Those are tiny little people and they're no bigger than the people in front of the, no, it's exact replica. It was built in 1897. Nashville is known as the Athens of the South. That's why it's called that. Yeah, I've been there. Anybody been there? I've been to Nashville. Yeah, no, it's exact replica. It's a strange thing. I agree. No stranger than Memphis, than that little strip of the Mississippi that has all these Egyptian references. And you get the pyramids in Memphis and you get, it's all, I don't know whether it's a Tennessee thing or what. I was in Kentucky, so I don't know. We didn't do that in Kentucky. I was 2 hours from Nashville. It wasn't that far away. So that's the sculptural program. Here's one of the metoepes that depicts the Lapith and the centaurs, Lapith fighting a centaur. So in other words, a Greek fighting a barbarian. And it's high classical style. It's the same style. It's sort of that perfection of proportion and form. While it's in the middle of a wild battle, you don't really get a sense of out of control wildness. It's really quite static in many ways. And it's a strange image in that it's sort of very artificially constructed, but you don't notice it right away until you start looking at it. First of all, there are proportional issues right away. That's a half man, half horse. That horse doesn't even come up to his waist. How many horses have you seen that don't even come up to your waist. I mean, that doesn't make sense. Number two, how is he in relation to that centaur? How is he actually standing? If the centaur is behind him, how is his left arm behind the centaur? I mean, think about it. I mean, you don't notice that, do you? But when you do notice it, you realize, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all.
If he were to swing around and try to sit on the centaur.
He'd have to squat down. He'd have to squat down to do it. But he seems to be parallel to the picture plane. If he's parallel, if that arm's not reaching straight back, it can't possibly, he can't be both behind and in front of the centaur. And he is. He's both behind and in front. And not to mention that lovely drape over his arms. I mean, it's beautiful, but what's it doing there? And how is it staying in place? It's just sort of hanging over two arms. You're in the middle of a battle, and this thing, this beautifully draped thing, just hangs there while you freeze. Now, the fact that it's so very static and frozen is because of the fact that it's dominated by horizontal and vertical lines. When we look at the construction, well, first of all, it was brightly painted. Don't want to throw you off again, but yes, it was brightly painted. And there's enough bits of pigment left that they can reconstruct it. So we know what it looked like. I mean, this is 40 feet in the air, so you've got to have some way of seeing it. Yeah, it is almost 6 foot tall. They're big. These aren't tiny little things. They're big, but it's still way up there. So it had to be brightly painted. But it's very, very classically composed. And I'm going to talk as we move into later periods about, we still talk about classical composition. It's a term that goes back to ancient Greece. This is an example of it. It's very structured. It's very framed. You get this sort of curving frames bookmarking it in a sense. That's the frame. And then the other lines are dominated by horizontal and vertical. The only diagonals you get form an equilateral triangle, which is a stable triangle. It's not, it's what we call, literally, we call that a stabilizing triangle, because it can't be moved, it can't be formed. And instead of the angle creating a sense of movement, it actually creates a sense of stability, as if you're like locked in that place and can't move. I used to have a dog that when I'd take her for a walk and she didn't want to go back in, she'd spread all 4 legs out and lock them to create this incredibly stable thing that wouldn't move. Fortunately, she was very little and I just picked her up, and she never figured that out. But it's the same idea. It's that stabilizing, lock you in place. And that's very Greek. I like the idea of it being choreographed and implausible. I love that. It is very much so. Of course, the replica. So we're going to look inside. This is actually the Athena Parthenos in Nashville. It is an exact replica of the original Athena Parthenos sculpture that was in Athens, which disappeared a long time ago. We don't know when that disappeared. It's made of gold and ivory. It disappeared a long time ago. Certainly, if it were still around when the Turks got there, they would have taken it, but I don't think it was even around then. We don't know exactly when it disappeared. We do know exactly what it looked like, however, because there were many replicas made. This was famous. This was like, you go to Paris and you bring home a little Eiffel Tower. There were little figures of it that we find all over the world that were sold like to tourists. So and it was on coinage, other things like that. So we do know what it looked like. And certainly it was written about all the time. This again, overseen by Phidias. When I say Phidias made the sculpture, I mean, he was in charge of a huge workshop of hundreds of artists. He didn't physically make it. This is what we call a chryselephantine sculpture, as were most of the other giant figures. Chryselephantine means it's made of ivory and gold. That's what it means. However, it's not solid anything. It was built from a wooden frame. It's like the Statue of Liberty that has all this open framework inside, although this was wooden. It was an open wooden grid-like structure, and only then with sheets of ivory and gold over it. It's not solid at all. There were questions at the time about corruption. Both Phidias and Pericles at one point were charged with corruption, saying, you know, they got a lot of money from this gold, that they made some money with this project. Phidias was in fact ostracized afterwards. It seems like he probably did make a good deal of money out of these projects. Pericles was not, however, that was just dropped against him, but Phidias did seem to be dipping his fingers into the construction budget for much of this. We see her with a Nike, or pronouncing it correctly, a Nike, a victory figure, a winged victory figure. She was about 40 foot tall, we know that, so about 4 stories tall. And certainly a very famous figure. Now, that war that had been building up in Greece finally, you know, broke out by 431. Factions had developed and identified themselves. It was largely Athens, which is all of the yellow areas, and her allies. Most of the colonies in Asia Minor were funded by and affiliated with Athens, where the other leading force, led by the Peloponnesian League, and remember this is the Peloponnesus down here, and Sparta was the central leading figure in that side. Notice up here we have a neutral Macedonia and Thessaly. We'll be talking about them in just a few minutes, but they fight on and off. This 431 to 404, it's not continuous warfare. There are 6 or 7 different little mini wars and conflicts within that period. It's sort of on and off, but eventually in 404, Athens does fall, and Sparta moves in and tries to set up a Spartan style government in Athens, so-called 30 tyrants that were set up. It doesn't last for very long. Sparta, the others, I mean, they wanted to defeat Athens. They didn't necessarily want to go in and rule another city. So after they knocked them down a peg, they just went home. And by 404, what we really have as we move into the 4th century, a depleted Athens. All the city-states are worn down. Nobody's has massive egos anymore, certainly not Athens. And they're leaving themselves wide open in a sense for anyone else who comes along, and other people will come along before that century is out. The style of the 4th century is known as the late classical, and the late classical style is moving away from, or beginning to move out of the sort of absolutism of the high classical. The art becomes more sort of human, less sort of superhuman. The most famous sculptor of this period is Praxiteles, and Praxiteles worked in both marble and bronze. There's always been dispute over whether this is an original marble by Praxiteles or whether it is a copy of what would have been a bronze. It has gone back and forth and back and forth. I think today most people think of it as an original. The reason it's so problematic is there are problems with either way. I can make an argument either way that it's not that. I can make a negative argument. It's hard to make a positive argument. First of all, I'll give you that in a minute, but it depicts 2 gods, Hermes, the messenger god, and the infant Dionysus. And there are many stories of the birth of Dionysus, and we talked about them. He's the god of wine. He was raised by, actually, Hermes helped raise him, took him to an island. Dionysus is the only one of the Olympian gods whose mother is mortal. And Semele is his mother, and she, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but she like burned up when she saw Zeus. She sort of turned to cinders, and therefore Zeus had Hermes take the boy to protect him and take him to an island, and he was raised by nymphs there. But it was always this sort of interesting relationship, sort of a fatherly relationship with Hermes. And in the original sculpture, the child was reaching out, and Hermes was holding a a bunch of grapes and sort of teasing the baby. Maybe he's the god of wine, right? So the baby was reaching out for the grapes. Right away, there's a lighthearted quality to this that you would have never seen in the high classical period. It was just, there was a seriousness to that work. I mean, their figures of mortal men were more godlike. It's sometimes said that, you know, in the 4th century, you know, the gods come down to earth and they're more human than the humans were a century earlier. So you do have that. There's certainly a softening of the face. I wouldn't call it a smile. He does seem to be smiling with his eyes, if you know what that means, which usually has to do with the eyebrows more than anything else. But it's definitely lighthearted in a way that others weren't. When you compare it to the Doryphorus, it is a different canon. Praxiteles is not using the polyglot canon. It's a different ratio of proportions. The torso is longer. You can see it's more elongated figure. When you look at it, it's different. It's not quite so heavy and squat. It's taller. And even the muscles have softened. It's not so extreme in the musculature. So, and the hair, you know, instead of tight little striations, it sort of curls and they're kind of bouncing around, a lot of differences. So you can see that here when you look at the face, the relaxation of the face, quite different. Still classical, but late classical now. Let's look at the whole figure again. Now, when you look at this, there are some things that make you think, well, this had to be bronze, because we see a support, right? You see that left arm is leaning on something that looks very much like an added support, and that little strut at his hip looks like something added, so it must have been bronze. The problem is, if you look at his stance, he's standing on his outer leg, and he's actually leaning. He's not just standing in contrapposto, he is leaning on that post. Now that means if this is a copy of an original bronze, that post had to be there in the original bronze. Because if you remove that, he looks like he's falling over. You can't have this without the post. It isn't an add-on, it's part of the design. Which now has made people think, no, this has gotta be original. This has gotta be a marble, made this way, designed this way. Because nobody ever made a bronze sculpture that was leaning on a support. They just didn't do that. So they finally, I think, convinced me. It's taken a long time, because I was always in the belief that this is a copy, but I'm starting to think, no, this was made in stone, because we know he worked in stone. He did do it. And there's a lot of stone from this period. So what happens to the rest of Greece? Well, Philip happens to the rest of Greece. During the Peloponnesian War, when all the city-states were fighting each other and depleting all of their forces and everything else, Philip of Macedon, or the Macedonians, were quietly sitting out that war. And by the mid-4th century, Philip II, the king, had moved down and controlled all of Greece, and he did so very easily. Did anybody watch the series that I told you about, the one on Alexander the Great? Wasn't that wonderful? I thought, I want to watch it again. But it sort of comes in right when Philip is now starting to think about moving to the Persian Empire, and then he's assassinated and his son Alexander takes over, and it's about Alexander moving east. So if you haven't watched that, if you have Netflix, it's just called Alexander, the Birth of a God, or something like that, Creation of a God, or something. You can't miss it. It's fairly new and really very good. But the Cleopatra one is even better. If you haven't watched that, watch the Cleopatra one. So then Alexander takes over, and in that mini-series, it focuses on some of the early battles along here as Alexander's pushing eastward, and it focuses on the battle. One of the major battles is the Battle of Issus, and when I saw it, I immediately thought of this, because it's remember that in the one battle where they make eye contact, where Darius is in his chariot, they make a big deal of it in the miniseries, where they literally are there and Alexander and the Persian king make eye contact in this battle, and they talked about it. There's this is a Roman mosaic from the 1st century that depicts Darius and Alexander at the Battle of Issus making eye contact, which tells me that story, that moment historically was so famous that even in the ancient world, they remembered that story. And the Romans knew that and told that story about these two greatest men in the world at the time, the most powerful men in this part of the world anyway, in battle, making eye contact with one another. Yeah.
And the Persians conquered all of Greece when that.
Persians never conquered Greece. They were driven back in the Persian War.
Well, why was Alexander so aggrieved by?
Yeah, he was, wasn't he?
Yeah.
That's a good word. He was aggrieved. I'm really not sure what that is, other than they were barbarian. They've made a lot of reference to them being barbarian, and they were still over there pushing against those Greek city-states. While he may have conquered the other city-states, he still recognized them as Greeks. He still identified as Greek. And the Persians were still over there right on the other side. But yeah, it struck me that I didn't understand his anger at them, like they had done something to him, but I'm not aware. There could be other subtleties that I'm not aware of something that really angered him, but it was personal, like, got to go after these Persians. So yeah, I'm not quite sure about that, but he definitely was angry. But you can see that series actually ends when he took Babylon, and that's when Darius is actually killed by his own men. And they kind of end it there. And I kind of thought, why did you end it there? It wouldn't have taken them long to extend it just a little bit further, because frankly, he doesn't live that much longer than that. They could have extended this. They could have taken 15 minutes and finished the life of Alexander. Instead, they let him hang there in Babylon, and you got to go out and look up what happened to him. I thought that was weird.
And another thing I questioned about was the Persian Empire had gone into India.
Yeah.
And
well, the Indus. Nobody made it past the Indus River.
Okay.
But they were in India, west.
So did Alexander conquer more?
No, he went to the Indus River.
Just Persia. What Persia had?
He went a little further north. He spread out a little more in Egypt. And then he controlled all of everything west, Greece and all that, which the Persians never did have. So he was bigger than the Persian Empire. So he did continue pushing west and made it. The problem with every empire that reaches these limits, every big empire is always fallen, because there's always a limit beyond which you can't, taking land is a lot easier than holding it once you've taken it. And these men were so far away from home. They wanted to go home. They didn't see any reason for staying way out there in India. We made a point. We conquered them. Can we go home now? It's very hard to administer. I mean, the Romans found it really hard. Administration is what brought down the empire. It brings down empires because, you just don't want to control them anymore. So on the way back, on the way home, this is when Alexander dies in 323, the age of 32. He had no children, no heirs. Don't know how he died. Fever, poison, maybe he was assassinated, maybe just died of fever. People did. So we don't know how, but he died. Now, with no heirs, this could have just fallen into complete chaos, but his generals stepped in pretty quickly. And while, there's some fighting between them, but they ended up dividing it into three parts. Ptolemy, who's in the miniseries, his best friend Ptolemy that he grew up with, Ptolemy gets Egypt. And himself, even though he complained about it, this was in the series, he complained when Alexander was made a pharaoh. Ptolemy himself was made a pharaoh actually as well, and started the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, which will last for 300 years. And we'll come back to that because his last descendant pharaoh is Cleopatra. Although it's not his last descendant because she had children. Her daughter lives on in Western Africa. Seleucus takes over all of this area. It looks like, whoa, he got so much more, but he got mostly desert is what he got. It looks like he got a whole lot, but he really didn't. And then Antigonus got all of his northern area, and particularly Macedonia and Greece. So beginning with the death of Alexander, that marks the beginning of the Hellenistic age. When he dies, it's called that because Hellenistic literally means Greek-like. It means it's like Greek. One of the things they didn't talk about in that series at all is the fact that one of Alexander's goals was to spread Greek culture, that he was a highly educated young man taught personally by Aristotle. He was very learned in the arts and philosophy and poetry, and he wanted to spread Greek culture. After all, the Greeks had always believed their culture was the greatest one on earth, the only civilized culture in the world, and he wanted to spread that. So as he moved his empire, he brought Greek culture with it, and he didn't really replace the cultures that were there. He merged with the cultures that were there. And so Hellenistic culture and the world becomes a kind of merging of cultures, a kind of hybrid. So when we talk about Hellenistic Greek art, we're not talking about pure Greek art anymore. We're talking about a hybrid of Greek and influences from all these other parts of the world. And that's why it's so decidedly different. I mean, we still call it Greek, but it might have been made, way over here. In Antioch, that would still be Greek because this was the Macedonian Empire and they were a Greek empire. And so you could be made a long way away from Greece and still be considered Greek. And I mean, not you as a person, but remember how they defined Greek. What made something Greek? What made a person Greek? Language. So he's spreading the language as well. Now, there's a few key pieces from the Hellenistic period that are very famous. Most people adore Hellenistic art. It appeals to our sensibilities. It's beautiful and naturalistic, but it has energy and emotion and drama and all those things we prefer more today than the Greeks did. And this is certainly one of the most famous, the Nike or Victory of Samothrace. Samothrace is an island off the coast of Turkey. And we're not sure exactly where this was made. It might have been made in Rhodes. There was a huge sculptural center there in Rhodes. It was originally located at a precinct, a sanctuary for the gods. It was a theoi megaloi, which means the great gods, a sanctuary for all of the gods. And it was way up on a hill. It was sitting way up on the hill. You looked up at it and there was like a waterfall, and it was designed to look like a ship, the prow of a ship. And the winged Victory was alighting on the ship. That's what Victories did. Winged Victories, they're female figures with wings. And if you saw one, you were going to win. And when a winged Victory lands on a ship in a naval battle, you're going to win. So that's what was happening. So it's absolutely stunning. She had arms that are broken off. Clearly, you can see them there in the drawing on the left. Obviously, she had a head, which is gone, but you can see the wind whipping around. The way the sculptors captured these different sort of densities of material and texture, the drapery is this very diaphanous and it's clinging to the body and flowing around, and yet the wings are this heavy, these are the model for Christian angels. This is where Christian angels come from. This, in terms of what does an angel look like, it's totally based on Greek Nike figures. So I just, in my mind, this is like all the other angels. The difference is every angel depicted in Christian imagery is male, while Nike figures are female. Other than that, that's what they're based on. However, of all of the angels, and we're going to see more of them as we get into the Middle Ages, this is the only one I believe could fly. I mean, these are the only wings I've ever seen that have the kind of weight to them and strength to them that looks like, you know, she really could be like alighting on this prow of the ship. It's a stunning piece. And of course, that's why it's placed where it is, you know, at the top of the staircase in the Louvre, so that you look up at it just as it would have been meant to be seen way up at the top of this mountain peak. So a beautiful example of Hellenistic art. Has all of the qualities of Greek art, the naturalism, but now with the emotion and energy that comes with the Hellenistic period. This is another very famous one, the Laocoon and his sons, which comes from the Trojan War story. Although it does not come from Homer's version, it comes from the Aeneas, it's Virgil's version, because it's a Roman interpretation of the story. We'll talk more about that when we get to Rome. Romans consider themselves descendants of Trojan immigrants. We talked about this in the mythology class. I'll remind you of that. But Laocoon was a priest of Troy, and he, along with Cassandra, the daughter of the king, Priam of Troy, warned the people, tried to warn people not to bring in this horse. You know, at the end of the Trojan War, the Greeks came up with this muse, it was Odysseus' idea, to leave this giant horse as a gift and then sail away. But not everybody believed that they really sailed away. And this priest of Troy tried to warn them. He's the one that said, you know, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. That's where it comes from. You know, Greeks aren't going to leave you a gift. Be careful. And of course, nobody listened to him because the Trojans were tired of war. They wanted it over with. They wanted to believe that and we know what happened. Of course, it was full of soldiers who came out and opened the gates, you know, the end of Troy. But as he's trying to warn them, either Athena or Apollo, one of the two who supported the Greek side in that war, sent these snakes to basically shut him up. And Aeneas tells the story, and there are 2 or 3 other sources that tell the story. This is Laocoon and his 2 sons, and they're being killed. The snakes wrapped all around them to shut them up. Shut him up so that he couldn't warn the Trojans. You know, in that story, all of the gods took sides. You had some that were aligned with the Trojans, some that were aligned with the Achaeans, who we identify with as the Greeks. So it's a story of that war, but it's a beautiful design and couldn't be more different from high classical. Now, this was actually discovered, this was made in Rhodes. It is today in the Vatican. It was discovered in Rome. It had been brought to Rome and was discovered in the excavation of a Roman emperor. I'm trying to remember which emperor had it in his private sort of palace area. I don't remember which Roman emperor, but anyway, it was in Rome. And when it was discovered, do I have something else? When it was discovered, in 1506 and excavated, Michelangelo was on site. This is the sculpture that Michelangelo saw. In fact, he was in the Vatican. It was while he was painting the Sistine ceiling that this was unearthed and brought to the Vatican. And it had a huge impact on his figure style. When we look at the Sistine ceiling, we'll look at these Michelangesque figures, as they're known, these very muscular figures that are very influenced by Hellenistic sculpture, and particularly this one. When we compare it, you can see that where the classical is dominated by stabilizing forms, this one is completely dominated by the dynamic diagonal line. And there's nothing more dynamic than a diagonal line that shoots right through the piece. It's a very powerful design. And then one last Greek piece, again, need to talk about. This is, first of all, this is not the Venus de Milo Isles. Cross that out, mark that out of your brain. Don't ever call this Venus de Milo, please. It is Greek, not Roman. It is the Aphrodite of Milos, but it is the sculpture that misinformed people call Venus de Milo, but only Italians do that. So it is Aphrodite of Milos, and it's interesting in so many ways. First of all, it was made in the 2nd century BCE, right in the middle of the Hellenistic period. However, it is not in that very dynamic, active style. It was made during a period of classical revival. Just like we have nostalgic fads for styles from the past, there was a kind of nostalgic fascination with their own heroic past in the 2nd century. And you find in the middle of the Hellenistic period, they start making these classical looking pieces. They look like they could have been made in like 450 in the classical style. It's classical revival. It's a revival style. Now, when this was found and brought to Paris, it was in Paris. The Louvre was short on classical sculpture, and that's what they wanted. They wanted classical sculpture. Napoleon had just been forced to give back a whole lot of stuff that he had looted, and the Louvre was kind of embarrassed that they had to get rid of a lot of stuff. And this comes in, and they make a real big deal out of it, a classical Greek sculpture, which was the greatest thing you could find. And notice this base right here, which is not right here. Now there's a side of the base that had an inscription that clearly identified this as Hellenistic. But the French took it away and hid it so that they could advertise this as classical and say that it's a 5th century. So they hid that plinth for a long, long time in the back, and it has since disappeared. We don't know where it is, it's gone, but we do know it was there in the 19th century and that it clearly identified this as being Hellenistic, but they didn't want it to be Hellenistic. They wanted it to be classical. And so they intentionally falsified the information on this piece so they could sell it in a sense to the public. However, we know a lot more about art history now and archaeology. And while the stance, the contrapposto, the carving, the lack of emotion say that it could be classical, the fact that it's a semi-nude female says that it's not. There are no semi-nude, that's a Hellenistic thing. So even without that, I think we could argue that this was Hellenistic, but we do know that there was a plinth somewhere that identified this, and we know it because there's a drawing from 1821 that clearly shows it in place. In 1821, it was there. However, by the time it went on display in the Louvre and they had the big parties and the big, introduction, it was gone. Interesting, huh?
How is it that Napoleon was forced to return things? Public pressure?
Well, he was out of power. When he went out of power, I'm not sure where the pressure was coming from, other nations, but for whatever reason, he took a lot of stuff. He kept a lot of stuff too. I guarantee they're still filled with stuff Napoleon brought back, but he had to return some things, and I honestly don't know the details of that. I don't know if it was necessarily Greek stuff or not. It could have been from anywhere because he brought things from a lot of different places. Okay, let's talk about Rome. Rome and Greece get linked together a lot, and we'll even do that. We talk about when we're talking about later periods, we're more likely to link them together, but they're really very, very different. We know that Greek art was all about beauty, finding that perfection, harmony, balance, ideals. The goal was the heroic ideal, the essence of the heroic figure. And their contributions were in aesthetics, moderation, clarity, and a sense of beauty. Almost none of that mattered to the Romans. Romans were very practical. Most everything was about serving the emperor and the political state. And their contributions are largely in engineering, government, and law. The Romans never saw a work of art or heard a story that they couldn't politicize. Everything Roman is political. Everything. I've yet to find anything that doesn't have some political reason for why it is what it is. Not so with Greece. So very different goals. And if they can use the Greek style to communicate those ideals and goals, they will do that. We divide Rome into the early monarchy. So Italy is peopled by a lot of different people. There are a lot of different tribes and people in Italy. I'm not going into all of that. They did have a monarchy, 7 kings of Rome. Again, we talked about this in the mythology class. The first king, Romulus, Rome is founded by the brothers. Actually, it's just founded by Romulus because he'd already killed Remus, his brother, by that time. How much is mythology of these kings? How much is real? We don't know. We talked about several myths associated with those 7 kings. We know that in 509, the last king was removed from power. He was a horrible person, as was his son, and it was replaced with a republic. Rome, throughout all of its history, spent more time as a republic than it did as an empire. And yet people tend to dismiss the Roman Republic as if it's, oh, just this little preliminary thing before the empire. No, it was a republic for longer than it was an empire. It was a republic all the way down, for 500 years, all the way down to 27, technically, or so. We'll talk about that, talk about how it changes. And then it became an empire, which continued. When does it end? Who knows? We'll talk about that when we get there. You can make arguments for all sorts of moments in time when it ended. You could even make an argument that it never ended. And I'll make that argument for you, because in some ways it didn't. So we'll talk about that later. The development of art in Rome is different. When we looked at Greek art, we followed stylistic change, right? You had that early geometric, you had an archaic style, and then you had an early classical, high classical, late classical, Hellenistic. These are terms that define style changes. That's not how we look at Roman art. All the distinctions in Roman art are largely political distinctions, the difference between each different period. Rome was imperialistic from the beginning. Even during the Republic, they conquered a lot of territory. It's a very different way of thinking about government and rule. In Greece, the city-states wanted to have influence and power and control, but they weren't out imperialistically capturing territory until you get to, the Macedonians later. That's a little different. But the Romans from the beginning are conquering territory and ruling from Rome. So the Republic is already imperialistic and spreading. The only real competition they faced, serious competition they faced, was during the Republic, during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and that was against the Carthaginian Empire, which ranged all around the Mediterranean, including all along North Africa and up into Spain. They were pretty well balanced when they came to blows in the 3 different Punic Wars that they fought. The last of which was when the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who was in Spain, marched his troops. You can see how close they are over here in Sicily. They're just a hop, skip, and a jump from Rome. So all of the troops were down here defending this area. So Hannibal goes overland from Spain up and around and comes down with all of his elephants and animals, comes down and actually circles Rome Rome was about to fall. The problem is Hannibal and his troops had been marching hard for a long time, and they were depleted. And before they could attack Rome, they needed time. They needed to rebuild strength, resupply, etc. So they waited. That was the choice that made the difference. While they were waiting, Rome became aware of what was happening, and one really brilliant Roman general named Scipio knew that if they chose to stay and fight in Rome, they would lose. So what Scipio does, anybody remember? Anybody know what Scipio did? Brilliant move. He took, doggone it, he took the Roman army. Every time I try and use my cursor, it moves ahead. He took the Roman navy and he sent it straight to Carthage. And so now you've got all of the Roman navy off Carthage and Rome surrounded by Carthaginians. So now it's a matter of who's gonna blink. You could sit like that forever, but somebody's gonna get scared. Carthage got scared, and they sent the message to Hannibal to get back to Carthage now. And that did it. The Romans attacked Carthage, destroyed the city, famously salted the ground. And salting the ground means nothing can grow there again. It's like the worst thing you could do. And once the Carthaginians were defeated, that was really it. They really didn't have, not that they aren't constantly fighting, and on the borders, there's the Gauls, and they're always fighting, but in terms of a big empire, they never faced another big empire. They're smaller threats. So that's in the Republic. So they're moving along. Now, in terms of what sort of develops in the Republic, they're very influenced by Greek art. There are Greek colonies all around southern Italy. They see Greek art. They've been interacting with Greeks forever. The Romans have a kind of admiration for the Greeks. You have to remember that to the Romans in, say, 1st and 2nd century, Greece was an ancient world, just as it is to us today. It was hundreds of years ago. It was their history too. It was a long time ago. And they think of the Greeks with great admiration. They think of the Greeks as philosophers, scholars, artists, and intellectuals, and they admire them. And so they're going to be influenced by Greek art. It's going to look naturalistic. And who do you think made all those copies we look at when we study Greek art? It's the Romans. It's because they took all those bronzes, they copied them all, they filled their gardens and all their great homes with Greek sculpture, copies of Greek sculpture. So of course it's going to look very Greek, but there are many art forms that are uniquely Roman, and how they use that style is unique to Rome. And one thing that is unique Roman that Greeks would have never done is realism. Here's realism for the first time in art. Those are real portraits of real people. What is realism? It's truth telling. Greeks never told the truth. The Greeks idealized. Yes, they were naturalistic. They looked believable, but they weren't portraits of real people. They were idealized. Everything Greek is ideal. Roman, no, it's real. It's truth telling. So you get real portraits. And in fact, the other thing that they really invent is the portrait bust. I like this piece because it shows a full standing figure holding two portrait busts. So it's a sculpture of a sculpture, which is interesting. You have to ask, well, why do we have a sculpture of a man holding two other sculptures? It's got to be a reason for that, right? He must be wanting to tell us something. Yes.
That in your previous slide,
Yeah.
Carthage is about Tunisia today.
It's the entire north coast of Africa, but Carthage is probably, I'm not that up on modern borders, truthfully, but I'm guessing it's probably there. I have to get out a map, but it sounds right to me. So what's he telling us? Well, let's look at the Roman social system, and that'll give us some idea why these mattered. First of all, the class system was clear. Not that Greeks didn't have a class system. Clearly, everybody had a class system. But in Rome, it's very clearly defined and very obvious. And it's a two-class system. You've got the plebeians and the patricians. There's always really an underclass, but they don't really talk about that. There's always really a class below that. But largely, patricians are the wealthy upper class that rule. The plebeians are the majority, more like a working class, a middle class, basically everybody else, unless you're born into this rich ruling family. So you've got the plebeians and the patricians. There's another system called the patronage system that was developed in Italy that I find really interesting. It's a system where a man, let's say a patrician, an important businessman, maybe a senator, but someone of the patrician class, a man who has money, he would have a number of clients who would be sort of affiliated with him. Let's say you're an ordinary person, you're just an ordinary plebeian, and you're having a problem, and you want help. And government isn't always there to help you, but this is nowhere to get help. So you go to this more powerful older person and you ask them for help. I need help with this. Can you see that this gets done? So he says, yes, I can help you. But in exchange, when I need something, I'll come to you and you'll help me. This is sounding familiar, right? I've just described the opening scene to The Godfather. And he says, yes. So this man would have a number of, and you can see that in cliens, you see the word client, and patronus, which means father, like the patron. So patronus literally is the father or godfather. And so all of your clients, all these people circling you, they're there for your use and your help, but you need to help them. It's a system that works. And it would not only be plebeians, but you would also be mentoring a number of younger patricians. So you may be of the upper class, but you're going to need a mentor before you're, important enough to be a patronus yourself. So that relationship is a powerful one, because in Rome, your connections to people, your lineage, who you're descended from, who you're connected to, all of these things matter. And they matter a lot. So this is why portraiture becomes so important. We need to see who these people are. We need to see who you're connected with. Who are your family? That's why faces matter. And so you would have a portrait busts of people to show. Anyone coming into your home sees that portrait bust, you're connected to him, leave that person alone. Even in sort of the mafia, it's called, you're connected. It's what it means. And it's not a coincidence that the system looks that way. This is where it begins. This is the origin of it. It's rooted in ancient Rome and it's never changed. It's never gone away because it works. It's a system that works for people. You have someone supporting you and someone you can go to. I mean, what more can you ask for? Governments try to take those roles, but they're not always good at it or not always able to help you. This is the system they had in Rome. And this is a system that plays into not only the development of portrait busts, but portraiture in general. And in fact, particular styles of portraiture called verism. Verism in Latin just means truth, right? Verisimility is truthfulness. I'll show you this one and then I'll come back to the map. Verism, this is the one in the Nelson Gallery. I love this. I love they don't have a lot, of these Roman pieces, but they're really nice examples. Here's a perfect example. Now this is later, it's during the Empire, but the style continues. It's, they're not hiding, they're not trying to hide anything. This is what someone looks like. Some of them are really, all kinds of wrinkles and warts and things that the Greeks would never have done because they weren't depicting real people, but they didn't care about those things. And in fact, it's a society that honors age. This is not a youth-driven society. Rome is not youth-driven. It's about age. And to show your age and wrinkles and everything else, all that does is show how long you've served the state, you know, how good you are at serving the Roman state. You should be proud of those things. So they're exaggerating, they're taking it even a step further to emphasize all of that, because that's power. It's all about power in Rome. So Roman gentlemen, that's go look at that in person sometime. So when the first century BC in the Republic is total chaos. There's 100 years of it. It's just a freaking nightmare in Rome. It's constant civil war. It's chaos everywhere. It's generals trying to take power. It's immigrants, you know, as Rome as a city. And Rome means two things. Rome means the city, but it also means the empire. So the word is both. And Rome as the whole empire of Rome, as it spread, you would get more and more people, immigrants coming into the city of Rome. It was a city, unlike Athens, which was like Greek. You know, Rome was multinational with many languages spoken, all sorts of different religions and practices spoken, very different place, and all the problems that come with that in terms of housing and jobs and all of it. So it's chaos for a century. There are precedents of one of the civil wars where Roman general Sulla brought his legions, his troops, and marched on the city of Rome. Roman legions, I want to talk more about the Roman legions, the army of Rome. They're a professional army, unlike most of the Greeks. There were no real full-time professional armies until Philip of Macedon was the first to have a true professional army, and Alexander continued that. But, you know, Athens, and I mean, you could say Sparta did, but Sparta was unique. Athens certainly didn't. But this was a real professional army, and they took care of them. They knew how to have a good army. You take care of the soldiers, you know, you give them, you know, when they retire, you take care of them well. But all of this was done by the general. You know, we have a sense of government that's very different from, say, the government of Rome. Everything centered on the Roman generals. Roman generals were responsible for their own legions. They decided how much they were paid, how much of the loot they got when they raided somewhere. And the loyalty of the legions was to the general, not to Rome. If that general told you, turn around and attack Rome, they'd do it. And legion fighting legion was not unheard of if two generals are fighting a war. So we got to think of it a little differently than we think of an army today. It wasn't one big coherent army. It was different generals in power, and they had their own legions and their own men. So Sulla actually turned his legions on Rome and actually took over the city and threw out his rival. There'd been a civil war. He ends up leaving, and it goes, he serves as a dictator. Throughout this century, there were a number of dictators. A dictator is a position in Rome during the Republic in which you could have someone temporarily take power. It's like declaring martial law, where if someone is temporarily appointed dictator, which we would pronounce dictator, but in Latin it's a dictator, which means one who speaks for me, to dictate, right? The dictator would be appointed as a temporary, like martial law, to bring order, and then they step down from that position and you go back to the Republic. And that's sort of how it had been going. And Sulla is important because of the precedent he set for turning his forces on Rome. So when Julius Caesar comes along, he is a general who is very well liked in the city, loved in the city. The people loved him, and he's gaining more and more power. And what happens is the Senate back in Rome starts to get afraid of him. And they order him back to Rome. They order him to leave the troops, come back to Rome, And that's what sets him off. That's when he turns his legions on Rome and starts marching back to Rome. He possibly would have done it anyway, but we don't know. But he did when they recalled him. He came back and crossed the Rubicon and came into Rome and made himself, he was the governor of Gaul at that time, came back and took over in Rome, declared himself dictator. And within a year of that, he was assassinated in 44 BC because they didn't believe he was going to give up that power. And fact is, I don't think he was either. I'm pretty sure he had plans to keep that, maybe change the title, but he wasn't going to give it up, and they wanted to keep the republic. Yeah.
There's a wonderful British teacher, historian, Mary Beard,
Well, I know that name.
and she has done a thing on Caesar, and it is Trump.
Oh, oh, yeah.
She talks to that issue. That.
Oh, yeah. If you know history, you see this happening. If you know history, you should be scared.
Can't remember if it's maybe 2 or 3, maybe just 1, but it just, wow, made my eyeballs pop as she made the comparison.
Everybody should study history. But yeah, he had no intentions of giving that up. So they assassinated him. Now, see, if they'd had ostracism, they could have ostracized him. They could have just voted him out for 10 years. But anyway, they assassinated him. And then civil war breaks out, really breaks out. And you have Julius's successors, his nephew Octavian, his mentee Mark Antony, work together for a while to hunt down the assassins, and then they turn on each other, fighting for power. Who will be the successor of Julius Caesar? If you watch the Cleopatra series, please watch that because it covers this period. It's about her relationship with Julius Caesar, her relationship with Mark Antony, the Battle of Actium, when Octavian and the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra are fighting. Cleopatra recognizes right away they're not going to win that, so she takes the Egyptian navy back, and Mark Antony loses. He ends up committing suicide. Eventually she does as well, because Octavian knows he's got to stop her. He's afraid of her. Again, watch it. It's mini series and find out why. But she will eventually also die by suicide. Octavian will go back to Rome. And he's loved by everybody because the civil war is over, because he's an actual relative of Julius Caesar. And finally, he's awarded in 27 the title of Pontifex Maximus, which we think of in relation to the Pope, but it actually means that you're in charge of the bridges. Pontifex Maximus. Which means you have all power in Rome if you're in charge of the bridges, which basically meant he was the first emperor. He changes his name to Augustus Caesar and takes the name Caesar from his uncle. At this time, Caesar is a name. It becomes a title later, but right now it's just his name, Caesar. After this dynasty falls, other emperors will turn it into a title of Caesar. But right now it's not. Begins the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first dynasty. This sculpture is from the Augustan period. It's one of the most famous. We have lots and lots of sculptures of Augustus. We know exactly what he looked like. He had this funny little colic in his hair. His hair would like stick up strangely right here. You can always recognize it. This was actually made after his death. It was found at Prima Porta, which is it was at a villa owned by his wife, his last wife, Livia. Long after his death, she had this made. So he was dead when this was made. It's realistic, but not veristic. This is unique to Augustus. For some reason, Augustus is always depicted young. And that's not verism, that's not truth-telling, because he did get old, but he's never shown that way. But he's the only one. He's the only emperor that's always shown that way. He is a little bit different in that sense. So what we've got now is a figure clearly influenced by Greek sculpture, but its intent is purely Roman, because this is not about the heroic ideal. This is about the power of one particular man, a general, and everything about it gives us this information. First of all, they've chosen a pose. It's known as the Roman orator pose, and it gives him power. He's speaking. This is in Rome, that meant people are listening to him. He's an orator, he's speaking, he's giving orders. There's a sense of power in that gesture. It's command. This is a man who's commanding people. His breastplate, he's wearing the uniform of a general, and there are scenes on it of a defeated enemy who's surrendering their standard. They didn't have flags then, but they had these things called standards. It's a tall pole, and it has various symbolic forms on it that identify who they are. And so you surrender it, just like you would your flag. So an enemy is surrendering to him, identifying him as a general. I didn't talk too much about that, but you can see how it relates to the spear bearer in terms of the body and everything else. But now an ideal form is turned into a real form to communicate this meaning. The little figure, the side is a little Cupid figure, and Cupid is down there for another very important and political reason. The Julio-Claudians claim to be descendants of Romulus and Remus, the founders of the city, who are themselves descendants of Aeneas, the leader of the Trojan force that fled from Troy and landed in Italy. That's important because Aeneas was the son of Venus in Roman mythology, and Romulus and Remus were the children of Mars and Rhea Silvia. So the Julio-Claudians are descendants of two gods, Mars and also Venus, and Cupid is the son of Venus. So that little Cupid down there reminds you immediately of that connection, that he's connected to a god. They would be, I tried to figure it out, but I think they're cousins, like 25 times removed or something like that, but you would be somehow related to that little Cupid. Now, this idea that an actual living person is related to a god is something totally foreign to the Greek world. No living Greek ever, they had myths about demigods, but there was no living Greek person who ever claimed to be a demigod or related in any way to the gods.
Wasn't Alexander considered?
Well, that's later. And the reason Alexander, well, when he became a pharaoh, he would have been considered a god, but that's not a Greek thing. That was an Egyptian thing. When Alexander's considered a god, it's because the culture of wherever he was considered him that. It wasn't coming from the Macedonian side. It was coming from the other culture. So yes, and it's one reason here, when it's okay, you have to think, where is Rome? Not the city of Rome, but Rome. That includes places where the idea of a living God is not unheard of, including Egypt. So you've got a lot of people even in the city of Rome for whom an actual man related to the gods is not an unheard of thing. So it's the beginning of the cult of the emperor. When Augustus died, he is deified. He's the first emperor to be deified, to be voted by the Roman Senate as a god. This is how you deify somebody, you take a vote. And this will now become standard. The cult of the Roman emperors, not all of them, because they weren't all worth it. Some of them are terrible and the people hated them. But if it was a good emperor, and Augustus is the George Washington of Rome, he will always hold that position. He will always be thought of as a great emperor. in Rome. He will be remembered that way because he did do a lot of incredible things. I hate to disillusion you one more time.